But yeah, we host these Livepeer community calls once a month, and we switch between ones focused on node operators, on general project updates. And this one is community led by Nelson, where he picks a specific topic to dive into that might be relevant to the community. We live stream it, we record it so people can watch later. And it's totally open for discussion, debate, other questions that people have. So anyone is welcome to participate. And if you're watching but not live on the call itself, feel free to send questions in through Discord. Maybe we'll see them and get to them as well. So cool. I'll hand it over to our community, one of the community leads, Nelson Ryan.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for that, Doug. And yeah, hey everyone. To anyone that's sort of new to these calls, my name's Nelson. I host the quarterly topic calls once a quarter. And yeah, the purpose of these calls is really to have an open discussion and really just sort of raise any topics that are sort of raised by the community that they'd like to discuss or recap. And yeah, just as sort of really an open conversation where anyone can chime in. And for this week's call, we had some requests to talk a little bit about governance within Livepeer. So I think for a lot of people on the call, it's probably going to be a bit of a recap of some of the basics. But I think it's also a great frame to then have an open discussion about where Livepeer's governance could go from here. And yeah, just kind of assess the sort of future looking forward. So anyway, to dive in, I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Cool. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. And yeah, so as I kind of mentioned on the call, to start with, we're going to dive into the Livepeer governance roadmap. So this will be kind of more of a recap. We're going to have a look at Livepeer governance today and all the different parameters involved. And then we're also going to have a look at Livepeer governance going forward and have a bit of an open discussion about what that could look like. And yeah, have a bit of a discussion around that. And also some time for sort of Q&A towards the end. All right. And so, yeah, to start with, I think governance is like a very sort of complicated topic. So I thought it was helpful to kind of recap where we've sort of come from and then like go into where we are today. And so this comes from one of the original sort of blog posts from Doug, which talks about the goals of the Livepeer network to sort of frame this governance. And so there's a sort of quote here. The aim of the Livepeer protocol is to incentivize the creation of a fully decentralized video platform, in particular emphasizing open access to build and broadcast on a level playing field. Any machine speaking with the protocol can join the network, use the network for its intended purposes of encoding and scripting live video, participate in the economic opportunities that are presented to users who contribute compute or manual resources in service of the network. No central party or company needs to be relied upon for the continued operation of the network. And so this is the kind of end goal of the Livepeer network. And to get there, obviously from the genesis of the network, there's been sort of a progressive transition to get there. And so we started with the snow melt alpha, then we went into the sort of stake distribution process, and then we began to sort of add decentralization of governance and also sort of opening up the protocol with the addition of like the polling mechanism and a few different mechanisms there. And so there's a few different sort of defining features which were outlined early to sort of think about decentralization in the context of Livepeer. So the first one is like decentralization of technology. Are we using trusted systems? Are there sort of like central points of failure in the system? There's decentralization of governance. How does the protocol make decisions? How are upgrades sort of made? And then also decentralization of stake and ensuring sort of token holders have a say in how that's run. And so I think, I mean, yeah, all these are complicated topics, but we're going to sort of look to try and unpack some of these, but also sort of feel free to chime in if anyone has any sort of questions or anything as we go through.
One thing that jumped out at me as you were going through that, it was kind of a realization that like the promise that you said was the end state where there's no reliance on any central party to continue to operate this network. It's interesting, and like in many ways that's actually fully achieved. Like the network is live, it's running, no one relies on any party or company to operate. Anyone can join, anyone can use the network, etc. I think that where the gap is still today is to go from, okay, the network can operate infinitely, or till the end of time in a totally decentralized way, but there's still some reliance on central parties to uh, improve the network or to fix bugs on the network, right? And it's really like eliminating those last kind of barriers of reliance that are the next phase.
Yeah, completely. And I think there's also that there's also I guess like the operating the network and ensuring that the network can operate on its own, but then there's also sort of improving on or bundling services to sort of make that, I guess, service more compelling or applicable to a wider audience, which I think there's always going to be opportunities for players to sort of do that on top, and there'll be value in that. And so in terms of the protocol governance, there's a few different sort of things here. So one is protocol upgrades. And so that's the ability to enact protocol upgrades via stake-based voting, which we do have in Livepeer today, which we can go into. Parameter updates. So this is things like enacting parameter changes. That could be to the governance mechanisms themselves, or that could be to the economics of the Livepeer protocol. So for example, last year a change was made to the inflation rate of the protocol. A parameter was changed there. And there was also a lot of discussion around the governance parameters. And then failsafes. So yeah, the removing of failsafes in the protocol, I think this is something that within other communities we've seen like a lot of focus on in terms of failsafes being being a centralization point, but I think it's also a very delicate one because failsafes are there for a reason. We're dealing with a network that has all networks are dealing with a lot of value, and you want to ensure that you have processes in place so that when there are critical errors, you can move quickly and ensure that that sort of value is protected and ensure that the network continues to operate as intended. So yeah. And so I think within the Livepeer governance roadmap, there was 4 sort of key steps. One was the decentralization of knowledge, LIPs, and polling. 2 was the addition of an extensible governance system. 3 was a binding voting system. And then 4 was the transition to future alternative mechanisms. And I think if we look at where we're at today, we're probably at that 4th step. So potentially looking at future mechanisms that could, of where the governance could evolve. And I think we can sort of dive a little bit into that.
I think later. Nelson, I think we still have to accomplish 3. So we have a voting system, but it is not yet finding where it will automatically enact changes. And that's definitely a step we want to get to in short order.
So to clarify, at the moment, the votes are being done and then the team is rolling out that upgrade. But the ideal end goal here is self-executing upgrades after the poll. Yeah.
Right. It's kind of been ratified that the security committee will be able to roll out the upgrades, and there's a set of processes, or there's a set of criteria to make it clear, when they will execute this. And they've lived up to that without breaking the social contract. But it would be nice to automate it and remove some of that reliance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, completely. And so, I mean, the first step in this was dispersing knowledge of the protocol and how upgrades are sort of made, which was the formalizing of the LIP process, the Livepeer improvement process or proposal process. And a community sort of accepted process for creating and discussing these proposals. And we're going to go into this later, but there's a whole kind of GitHub for discussing LRPs, and there's also calls where you can sort of join and get involved in the discussion of these LRPs. And also a polling application, which allows token holders to signal their approval and disapproval of these LRPs, which we've had a few of these kind of polls in the past. Then 2 is the extensible governance system, which was deploying a technically extensible governance system that can be used to upgrade the parameters and code of the protocol smart contracts. There should be a clear path for upgrading the governance system to give stakeholders control of the system. And then 3, as we were just discussing before, the ability to upgrade the governance system to use a binding vote system to approve or reject changes in the protocol smart contracts. And then 4, which is more speculative, which is the possibility of using alternative mechanisms in the future for voting. So one of these being Futaki, which at a high level is sort of using prediction markets for governance. I think that seems quite far off. We haven't really seen, or I'm not aware of a lot of examples of that being used in the wild today. And prediction markets are definitely in a fairly early sort of phase in general. And then there's quadratic voting, which one, I guess, sort of your popular example of that is something like Gitcoin, which uses quadratic funding mechanisms, which effectively is like a credit weighted sort of voting system where you apply sort of more weight to the amount of sort of votes people put into a particular decision. So yeah, that could be an interesting area to explore in the future. And then to sort of dive a little bit more into where Livepeer governance is at today and how it works. So first is the LIP process, which, as we sort of said, is the standard for making upgrades in the protocol. The LIP process was created to ensure everyone has an understanding of how these upgrades get made, and also understanding the process if people do want to make a proposal and what's sort of required from a community standpoint to get these sort of proposals approved. And so yeah, for anyone that's sort of new to the Livepeer community, you can find the LIP process or the LIP GitHub within the Livepeer GitHub. And there's a whole sort of process there where effectively you can see on the right with the index, which is a sort of history of all the different LIPs within the network. And you can also see within the Livepeer Explorer previous sort of proposals which have gone to a vote, and you can see like the outcome of those votes as well. So if community members do want to make a proposal, they can fork the GitHub and sort of make changes to basically build their own sort of LIP process. And yeah, so to clarify, the workflow for an LIP, so it goes from draft, sort of put out for feedback, then it goes on to a last call, and this is all sort of within GitHub or within the forum, proposed, and then effectively there's a poll created. It goes to either a yes or no vote, and then moves forward with any sort of last changes sort of incorporated into that process. And the recap on the polling system. So the purpose of the polling system is, provide a system for token holders to accept, reject an LIP. And the goals of this are to keep it sort of simple, ensuring the process participating is easy to understand and accessible, auditable, censorship resistant, and also open participation to ensure that all parties can be involved. Anyone should be able to create a poll, and poll creation requirements apply to all parties. And then, so to also recap, so with some of the governance parameters that are created for this poll process, so we have the quorum, which is the minimum percentage of an active stake that needs to vote in a poll in order for the poll result to be considered valid. The quota, which is the minimum percentage of voting stake that needs to vote yes in a poll in order for the poll result to be considered a signal to accept the proposal. Poll period, poll creation cost, and also the LPT, token contract. And I believe the poll creation cost today is 100 LPT.
Oh yeah, that's something that the community definitely brought up, revisiting or making a change proposal around, because that was set when the value was much lower, and now that's actually a pretty hefty cost to create a poll.
Yeah, no, completely. And yeah, so just to go over some of these other parameters, the quorum is set at 33%, quota is set about 50%. The poll period is around 10 rounds, or roughly 10 days. I think it's like around like 20 hours. Is that right, Doug?
Yeah, about right now with current block times.
Yep.
So it's probably like 8 to 9 days.
Yep. And then the other parameters within the Livepeer network is the economic parameters. So we have the inflation rate of change, which was changed last year. So it used to be set at 0.003%, and now it's 0.0005%, which effectively reduced the speed that the inflation was dropping, while the sort of target participation rate is above 50%. Because every round that the target participation rate is above 50%, the inflation rate drops. And yeah, so we've seen that drop. So the current inflation per round is now at 0.0196, which works out to be about roughly 7.15% annualized. And the current network participation rate has remained pretty healthily above 50%, sitting at 53% today. And yeah, so I mean, I think there's been brief periods in the life of the protocol where we've seen the participation rate dip below 50%. A lot of those events have seemed to be large holders sort of perhaps moving around stake, because those sort of events hasn't stayed like that for long. We have sort of seen stake restake, but it's possible we could see that drop below 50% in the future, particularly if LPT was perhaps being utilized in sort of other places within DeFi. And then this is just an example of sort of the Livepeer voting dashboard. So yeah, if anyone that isn't familiar with this is in the Livepeer Explorer. And you can see here a bunch of different LIPs which were voted on and were passed through. And here's just an example of a previous LIP which was passed, so LIP 25. And you can see here the amount of votes that voted yes and no, and the participation rate for that as well. And here's an example of a previous proposal within the GitHub. So this one was the inflation change proposal, which was made by Victor, which was the proposal to reduce that inflation rate. And yeah, so I guess before we dive into the sort of future for governance, I wanted to just park it there and see if anyone had any questions on how Livepeer governance works today, or perhaps anything they wanted to sort of bring up. Cool. All right. And then, so yeah, one of the other elements of the governance of Livepeer is also the grants committee. And so, yeah, to perhaps give a bit of a recap on how the grants committee works and its sort of purpose. So the grants committee was created by Rafi on the team as a way for sort of the Livepeer community to fund some of these kind of community goods in the early stage of the network, or sort of common goods, I guess. And effectively, yeah, during this period, people could delegate to the community node, and 50% of those inflation rewards went to this community node stake, which would be used to sort of fund these kind of goods within the ecosystem and support the Livepeer ecosystem over time. And yeah, some of the goals was yeah, basically as an early sort of mechanism for community governance, and for that funding to be transparent in these sort of early phases and over time. And from that, the Livepeer sort of community grants program was created, which was basically as a sort of way to begin to allocate some of this sort of some of these rewards for sort of valuable tools within the Livepeer ecosystem, with sort of small grants and then some sort of larger ones that were funded for a range of different things. And you can see the community node sort of address there. And yeah, so some of the goals that were set for the grants program was measurable results, achievable goals, demonstration of capacity, and just impact for the Livepeer network. So in terms of how impactful the different sort of proposals are going to be for the wider ecosystem and community. And so yeah, the grants committee has funded a range of different things. So that's everything from the Telegram alerts tool, which many of the community have probably used, which gives you sort of frequent updates on when sort of rewards are being called or when new rounds occur. The Streamflow staking app, the Livepeer 10-minute primer, as well as some of the sort of more recent livepeer.org website translations for Chinese, Korean, Russian, and Spanish.
Yeah, those translations have actually come up huge lately as there's been kind of an influx of new users from Korea, from China. So, it's great that the grants were able to fund that, and definitely should think about more in the future and keeping up with updates in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yeah, I believe a lot of those languages were kind of chosen based on some of the sort of traffic that was coming in from different regions. So I think, yeah, if we continue to sort of see more traffic from different regions, it would be great to see more and more translations to kind of expand the capacity of the support those sort of new, more extensive communities. And yeah, so in terms of how the grants committee works today, so today the grants committee is led by 3 members, which is Eric, Adam, and myself. And we have sort of fortnightly grants committee meetings where we sort of discuss proposals that have come in over that process. We view them. It's a sort of grants are issued on a rolling basis, and basically there's semi-annual grants targets with grants committee updates posted sort of regularly within the forum. And so that sort of gives updates on things that have been funded and sort of what the community grants program is sort of focused on. And there's also a public grants tracker, which you can find on the link here, which or on the grants committee GitHub, which provides a link of sort of how those funds have been spent to date. And so as a part of this, we've been exploring ways to sort of expand the grants committee. So this was always sort of part of the goal of the grants committee, was to sort of make this more inclusive over time. So we're exploring ways to sort of expand the amount of members in the grants committee, the sort of voices that are involved in that process, and also opening up to sort of incorporate community sort of engagement into that funding process. And also looking at some sort of different changes in sort of line with some other sort of grants programs that have been very successful within the sort of broader crypto ecosystem, like for example, Uniswap's new program or Community or Compound's new sort of grants program, moving into more of a quarterly phases process as opposed to this sort of more rolling process, and also sort of ramping up the amount sort of available for some of these grants. And yeah, so we're really excited to kind of ramp that up. And then also sort of expanding the amount of people on that grants committee multi-sig, and just sort of making that whole process more transparent for the community. And yeah, so before moving on, did anyone have any questions on the grants committee and how that works today?
This might be part of where we're going, but definitely would be interested in how you're thinking about the notions of allowing kind of token holders, community members to participate in, fund allocation decisions in the future out of the grants committee.
Yeah, so one thing that we've sort of had, I guess, community interest in and also been discussing is things like quadratic funding mechanisms. So that is effectively, perhaps using solutions like Gitcoin, where the grants committee could, for example, match funding of community sort of members. I think, that there's a lot of sort of factors involved in doing something like that. The Ethereum Foundation's been very successful in doing that, and that the sort of broader Ethereum ecosystem. But I think when you do these kind of quadratic funding or match funding sort of mechanisms, you also need a certain level of scale and participation for that to kind of be allocated effectively. And so looking at the kind of goals we outlined before for the grants committee, it's important to sort of, yeah, ensure that can be sort of gradually scaled, I think, and experimented with. But I think that's one way where more of the kind of Livepeer, ecosystem or community can get involved. So we could have orchestrators sort of match funding as well, and then perhaps in the future even applications building on Livepeer could also kind of match fund, and the broader Ethereum ecosystem. It could be a great way for there's perhaps people within the wider Ethereum ecosystem that would love to see things built on things like sort of Livepeer and Filecoin. As we sort of see more and more lots of different ecosystems within crypto kind of meshing more and more. So yeah, I guess that's one way we thought about it. But were you sort of alluding more to, yeah, I guess like on-chain voting for some of this stuff, or?
Maybe. I mean, I'd be curious about an experiment where you even tried to just use the existing on-chain governance voting mechanism to, approve or disapprove a grant proposal as voted on by the orchestrators and token holders. And, since there's no precedent or expectation that the committee would have to adhere to that, you could just publish like, a guideline of what you would adhere to, like a limit on the, an amount of capital for a grant if someone gets a proposal through or something like that. Might be an interesting experiment to try without having to build anything.
Yeah, no, completely.
There's another tool called that I know a lot of projects use, and was shared around our committee, snapshot.org, which allows token holders to propose and vote on ideas they have for proposals. If we don't want to conflate like the polling app on the Explorer with like grant stuff, that was something that was discussed, but maybe we can look into that some more.
This is maybe like tangentially related, but I'd be curious to hear people's views on the grant committee's allocation decisions, not only within the Livepeer ecosystem, like specifically to very Livepeer flavored things, but also the grant committee's participation in, say, other projects that are a part of like the broader open source ecosystem that Livepeer fits within. So say a variety of like tools that maybe kind of the Livepeer stack is built upon that like it'd be very hard to build Livepeer without. We know that like Gitcoin runs that quadratic funding program and has like rounds of this where like open source projects that don't have kind of their own funding model receive matched grants through that process. And what I found interesting kind of observing some of the kind of past rounds is that I feel like the contributions, like there have been projects that have like contributed to the matching pool in each of those rounds for, I'm assuming, similar reasons. So it's like, this isn't necessarily a Gnosis project, or this isn't necessarily a Graph project, etc. But this is something that contributes to like the wider open source ecosystem that this project fits within, and there isn't really a good funding model for that project. And I feel like that's been something that people have noted, like adds legitimacy to the project itself, just because it raises awareness and acknowledges the fact that like the project ecosystem isn't in its own silo that's really self-sustaining on its own. It like fits within this broader ecosystem that's not just Ethereum, but open source more generally. So yeah, I think that was like an interesting that came to mind. Like obviously need to weigh that with like all the other important allocation decisions that are really more Livepeer flavored, but maybe something worth keeping in mind, just like thinking about not only Livepeer flavored things, but things that are like tangentially related as well, and that enable a lot of the Livepeer flavored things.
Yeah, no, completely. I think we have discussed before as well in the past, like, should the grants committee be helping sort of fund things that are related to broader Ethereum scaling? So for example, like E2.0 research, or perhaps it even could be research on like layer twos and things like that, because I think that has been a pain point that like the Livepeer sort of, I guess, community has felt more recently. I think that is one where there is a very sort of direct benefit and synergy to the Livepeer ecosystem as well, if those sort of problems get solved. So yeah, I think that's something to think about as well.
I had another observation, and maybe this is this starts segueing a little bit away from the grant committee discussion, but I do think it's related to it. And this came to mind when there was that discussion topic of kind of experimenting with mechanisms to kind of distribute the decision-making power for grant committee allocations a little more. And this led me to just kind of make the observation that in one of the earlier slides, we were looking at the milestones for decentralized governance. And I think it's pretty clear that we've been delayed a little bit in getting into like the binding voting system era, right? Like I think, rolled out the polling system last year, and that's been useful from a coordination standpoint and adding legitimacy to the decentralized governance process in Livepeer, but we haven't gotten to that binding voting system yet. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that, but I think one of actually like the bigger contributing factors is actually costs and kind of like implementation concerns around like not only how this would be designed, but how this would be like effectively used so that people actually want to use it, especially considering rising costs on layer 1 Ethereum. And I think that's definitely been a big pain point, and it kind of makes future evolution of governance inextricably tied with kind of the general efforts to like improve the scaling story and transaction costs for Livepeer generally. But that being said, I think it feels like we're going to be entering into a more exciting era soon, especially given that scaling is a big focus on the core team at the moment, but just with some of the progress that's happened across the ecosystem, not only on scaling efforts, but just like peripheral tooling that helps with governance. So I think even though, relatively speaking, progress towards that binding voting system has been slow since the rollout of the polling system, I think the changing landscape of layer 2 and scaling and just additional peripheral governance tooling, I think will likely change that story a lot in the coming months. And I think that will, I think it will have a big influence on just like the core governance mechanism for Livepeer, but also potentially on like additional things such as like the grant committee, right? So if we wish to experiment with it, or if you guys wish to experiment with additional things, I think the number of things that we can experiment, ranging from snapshot to other things, is like kind of exponentially growing. And I think a lot of them are going to be more feasible soon, or likely will be more feasible soon. So yeah, looking forward to seeing that play out some more. So I think will be a lot more opportunities to accelerate that process soon.
Yeah, I completely agree. I just think if you think of like layer 2 scaling as offering near instant confirmation times at near zero cost, then all of a sudden the fact that you have all these tools available with, point and click interfaces to let people participate in governance or fund allocation decisions really removes so much friction and such a barrier from participation today that allows us to do a lot more kind of fast moving experiments.
Yeah, I think another interesting example that's less like scaling related per se, but I think is an interesting kind of suite of tools that's being pushed out by other members of the Theory ecosystem is, so Adam brought up Snapshot earlier. I know that the Gnosis team, who has done a lot of work on kind of establishing basically kind of the de facto multi-sig wallet that everyone in the Ethereum ecosystem uses. And then the latest iteration of that, the Gnosis Safe, which they've basically really productized that over the course of the past year and a half. I know that they've been working on this new system. I'm not sure what the kind of timeline for like it being ready for mainnet use is, but they've been working on a system called, I think it's called Safe Snap, where it's a combination of Snapshot and the Gnosis Safe, where they've built this system where you can conduct the votes in however way that you want. Well, like one of the neat parts about Snapshot is that you can like set your own scoring rules. So it might be just token weighted, or you might kind of factor in some like fancy math in order to update the scores. But you use Snapshot to aggregate the votes off chain. So it's completely free, which is like a big deal, right? So like we don't want any additional friction to participating in the governance process. So it's free, you aggregate all the votes off chain. And then there's this process where you can kind of demonstrate the result of the vote on chain. And then there's the ability to kind of configure it such that you could have the Gnosis Safe override that vote if like something went wrong. And then slowly you might kind of remove that restriction, right? So it's like the default behavior is that the result of the off-chain vote gets executed on-chain within some time frame. But you can add like some safeguards where a specified Gnosis Safe with like some members of the community can override that within that time frame. And then if you have a belief that the system will work well, then maybe you remove that override capability from that Gnosis Safe multi-sig over time. So even though that's not like L2 per se, it's not something directly enabled by L2, I think it's another example of like some interesting suite of tools that's being pushed forward that would be, I think, not only interesting for the grants committee to look at, but also for kind of the larger community for some of the core governance stuff in Livepeer to look at as well.
Yeah, completely. We've been looking at the grants committee, we've been looking at a few different solutions, even sort of like governance tools, like you said. So for example, there's like One Colony, which is on XDAI, and sort of like a governance framework, and sort of built to be quite transparent and can be sort of customized quite a lot. And there's a few other sort of, a lot of new ones emerging. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of sort of new tools and ways of doing things, which is really exciting to see. Cool. And so, yeah, that was the key sort of things I had to cover. But I think for the final session, I guess I wanted to leave it open to have like a broader discussion on, yeah, I guess decentralization of governance within the protocol in general going forward. So I think we've sort of talked about the grants committee and some of the sort of steps being taken there. I think some of the obvious ones that we discussed was in terms of the protocol having the binding voting being one kind of key change. I guess, yeah, one other area that's sort of been discussed is like things like failsafes in the protocol and sort of how we think about that. How do we see that evolving sort of over time? Yeah, I guess maybe that would be one to ask you, Doug. Do you sort of see that sort of security committee expanding over time? What are the sort of key things to think about there?
Yeah, that's a really good topic to get feedback on and get discussion. We've seen the usefulness of the security committee a lot in the recent months. After some of the scaling upgrades we did, there was a number of accounting bugs that got discovered, and the security committee was able to act, quick and responsibly to patch them up without, any loss of user funds or harm that came. So that was really valuable. So like just one fundamental question is, is the goal to get rid of the security committee so that no one has the ability to do these things? Or is it for the community to more formally, control who has keys on this security committee and what the size of that committee looks like and what the rules and restrictions of that committee are? And I would say, it certainly has been shown that if there was no security committee, then a lot of harm could have come to the protocol. So it would seem like, having this committee for the foreseeable future is a good thing. And the question becomes, well, how should we think about governance around that, such that it's not a, single point of failure, such that there's controls, such that it's ratified and accepted, and how that fits into kind of unstoppability and decentralization.
Yeah, I think another factor there too is even just time zones. Just factoring in, if we were to expand that security committee and there needed to be some kind of like majority vote to make those decisions. The whole purpose of this is if there is sort of a bug, that decisions can be made sort of quickly to protect the protocol. So I think, yeah, that's something that has to be kind of considered, and there isn't a super easy solution to. But I'm guessing most of that community today is probably in the US time zone.
It's not even disclosed,
Oh.
what the size of the committee is, who's on it, et cetera, right? Kind of for security purposes, but maybe that is something that, the community would want to see be transparent and have visibility into, right? Are there any projects that have, set good examples for how these kind of security or fail-safe committees work and are governed or controlled by the communities in certain ways?
I believe Synthetics is run by the DAO. I believe there's like a community sort of DAO that controls that failsafe. But I'm not sure the exact details of it.
Yeah, I don't think this. So this isn't live yet, but I've like had discussions about kind of the way that it could potentially be structured. But I know that the graph was considering this notion of a security. They're still pretty early, right? But they were considering the notion of a security committee, and some of the things that were suggested that I think are useful concepts are, in particular for the purpose of this conversation, is like different types of pauses. So right now within the Livepeer protocol, there's a single type of pause. It's kind of all-encompassing thing. If this is triggered, then basically all functionality ceases to work. So the negative implications of that are that, definitely that staking will not work when that happens, but it also means that no payments can be settled during that period of time. So if payments can't be settled during that period of time, then it kind of potentially causes like activity on the network to halt as a whole. So it definitely kind of increases the severity of increases the implications of that action. And an interesting suggestion that I've heard is having a notion of like a more partial pause and a full pause. And the partial pause is something that potentially a security committee could trigger, obviously going through the decision-making process set up for that security committee, but it's something that is a little easier to do, and it freezes, for example, only like deposits or withdrawals, for example, but other functionality can still work. So the downside of that is that if you have like things that mess up the accounting in the system, you kind of still let that happen, but you can't move value in or out of the system. And I think the assumption that you would have to have there is that you would be okay with the fact that accounting gets messed up as long as you can go back to a point in time and acknowledge when it was messed up. So that's like one way to kind of divorce or like separate out concerns a little more so that you can act a little quicker for a kind of security focused pause when you need to, because there is not as a dramatic of impact of that pause. And then that buys you time to take a more methodical approach, because you know that you're at least restricting movement in and out to kind of prevent value from being extracted from users. So may not be like the perfect thing, but I think it's an interesting idea to consider, just like creating these tiers and separating out concerns a little more.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point to consider. So I mean, yeah, I think that's all I really had to cover today. did anyone else have any other sort of questions or topics they want to bring up on the topic of governance, or perhaps just more broadly about Livepeer?
I think one thing to think about, this is not so much a governance question, but it's like a upcoming event that may be facing the community in the next 6 months or so. It's just as we do think about layer 2 scaling and think about that as a big potential change to the the user experience of interacting with Livepeer, hopefully for the positive dramatically, but also may require steps like migrating stake to the new instance of the contracts, or these sorts of things, and things may not be so automated. It'll be interesting to think from a governance perspective about the community kind of approving that change through the LIP process, but also needing to like actively participate in their migration or re-registering their nodes, or doing a transaction to move stake over, just kind of like when Uniswap migrates and you have to do a one-click transaction to migrate your liquidity from one pool to the next version. I don't know whether these mechanics will or will not be necessary, but it's interesting to think about like the role of governance in approving not just the upgraded protocol, but also the mechanics that will be used to keep things running smoothly and to migrate like stake and ownership over.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting distinctions you made there is like when you look at Uniswap, or even if you look at Aave with their sort of Aave Polygon today, a lot of those sort of DeFi projects have gone a direction where they have both. They still have the sort of classic layer 1 Aave, but there's also the Polygon Aave, because people are still getting comfortable with layer 2, and there's obviously some technical risk there. So I think, yeah, that's the other factor, is that for Livepeer, if it is more of a all-in decision, it's also a bigger decision to make, because projects like, for example, Aave can launch on a number of different layer 2s. And I think a lot of them are exploring a lot of different options when it comes to scaling, because it's sort of still in an early phase where it's not entirely clear what the direction most of the sort of Ethereum community is going in.
Right, and on Livepeer there is the good news that, again, like video doesn't touch the blockchain, so like video transcoding that's occurring via this peer-to-peer network off-chain can and will still continue to function. But I do think there is like the network effect of, you want this global, scalable, reliable network that's really cost effective, and that occurs via competition in one network. So you don't want multiple versions of this protocol deployed and fragmenting the network. Otherwise each of those little pieces wouldn't be as strong and competitive and cost effective as the one where all the value is. So just thinking about the governance process used to essentially like agree upon and come to consensus to and prepare for that sort of migration might look a little different than, like you said, an Aave that can have the protocol running on multiple chains at the same time.
Completely.
Cool. Thank you very much, Nelson, for putting this together. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add or ask about before we drop? Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for joining. This is recorded. It'll be posted online. It's been live streamed at livepeer.org.tv. So good to see that being put to use again. And I think next month we have a node operator focused community call, and there's been a lot of activity amongst orchestrator operators and people scaling up their GPUs behind there recently. So we'll probably have a lot to talk about on that front next month. So looking forward to it. See you all later. Thanks, Nelson.
All right.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Nelson.
Hey, Chris.